We're happy to have you, and I'll let Vita go ahead and do introductions. Oh, and there are also 2 other screenings in the coming weeks too. So there are 2 other chances to see this movie. We need to begin. So before we start, I want to thank you all for coming here and being a part of this event. I would like to formally thank a group of people who helped put this thing together, organize it, fund it, and give us the opportunity to have this event. So if you just bear with me, I'm going to read out names and thank yous. I would like to thank the IUSA Funding Board, the EDPOSA, SOEGSA, School of Education Graduate Student Association, Dean Gonzalez and the School of Education, Professor Mikuleski and the LCLE Department for their support and financial contributions. I would also like to thank our panelists, Dr. Mikuleski, Chair of the LCLE Department, Dr. Goodman, Chair of the Curriculum and Instruction. I'm losing my voice already still. And our K through 12 teachers, Terry Doherty and Debbie Wessel, and the representative from the project school, if they're here. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this. And finally, we're getting to the people who actually put this thing together and organized it. And that's the LCLE Graduate Student Association and the School of Education Graduate Student Association. And those names are Kirsten Connors, Veronica Fife, Jackie Sidnor, Bryce Medley, Beta Zachary, Julie Rust, Nick Husby, right?
It all works.
Thank you. Mona Said, Jehan Park, Beth Bulujos, right?
Buckles.
Sorry. These are my friends, I can mess up. Christy Wessel Powell, and Professor Cornel Molina and Professor Carmen Medina for their endless support and advice. And we're getting to EDPOSA, the Education Policy Student Association, Caitlin Baird, Caitlin Walker, Sarah Hess, Gayla Page, and Katie Perry. Kathy Perry, sorry. They're all Katies. They were all Katies. I was doing good, right? Right. And the ETS staff, and of course, Jane Cajo for her endless help with emails. And I apologize if I left anybody else's names out, but we really appreciate your help. So I'm gonna, but who's taking over now? You? Okay.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. My name is Christy Wessel Powell, and I'm a graduate student, first-year PhD student in the Department of Language Ed. And I wanted to let you all know that first we're going to be recording our session for educational purposes. And also I'm conducting research about all perspectives and reactions regarding this film. So some of you might have gotten the survey. I have a survey. I'm interested in what you think coming in and why you chose to come to view the film. And then if you're interested in being interviewed afterward about your thoughts, I would love to have that too. So if you didn't get a survey, I will have them available and I'll collect those. We'll collect them after the film is over. So definitely there's information on the back of surveys and you can come see me with any questions. I also wanted to note that there will be there are 2 tentative subsequent screenings of this film for those of you that may be interested in continuing the conversation or letting others know. Tentatively March 25th and April 19th, we're hoping to screen again. So that's that, and I'm going to hand it off to Sarah from EDPOSA to give you an idea about policy issues before we...
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah from the Education Policy Student Organization. If you're interested in joining our listserv to find out about events like this one, there will be a sign-up sheet at the back at the end of the movie. I'm just going to briefly introduce what this movie is about and some things that you might want to think about as you're watching it. So this is a movie by Davis Guggenheim, who also directed An Inconvenient Truth, and it was actually very popular before it even came out. There was a massive internet campaign to get people to pledge to watch the movie and to bring it to their town. And it also won several awards, especially at the Sundance Film Festival. However, it was not considered for an Oscar, and some people think this might be because it is kind of controversial. The basic premise of the movie is that neighborhood public schools are failing our children, and it focuses on teacher quality as a way to address that problem. It follows the lives of 5 students who are enrolled in public charter school lotteries. In the neighborhoods that these 5 children are in, the local charter schools are performing better. They have higher graduation rates and higher test scores. So the parents have enrolled, because the schools are over-enrolled, meaning they have more children who want to come in than they actually have spots. The children are enrolled in a lottery, and only some children will be randomly chosen. But some things that you will want to think about are that even though these particular charter schools are performing better than their neighborhood schools, that's not the case everywhere. Some charter schools do perform better than their neighborhood public schools, and some do not. The reason for this is that public charter schools are given a lot of freedom in what they can do. And in exchange for that, they have increased accountability for whoever holds their charter. So these charter schools have license to experiment with what they want to do with teacher quality in a way that the neighborhood public schools don't do. So that's something that you'll want to watch for in the movie. And also just keep in the back of your head that all charter schools are different and that these aren't necessarily representative of all charter schools, although many charter schools are outperforming neighborhood public schools. And like I mentioned before, if you're interested in talking about these kinds of issues, we'd love to have you on the EdCosa listserv, so please sign up afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, so without further ado, I'm going
And you're welcome to also, continue to add comments and questions as these panelists speak. I'm sure they will bring up some more thoughts. Okay, so we'll just start on this side. This is Dr. Jesse Goodman. He's currently the chair of the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. His primary scholarly interests include curriculum and cultural studies, Western intellectual history, teacher education, democracy in education, and school reform. His teaching responsibilities include working in the doctoral curriculum studies program and in a master's level pre-service teacher education program. Thanks for being here. This is Dr. Larry Mikuleski. He's currently the chair of my department, the Department of Literacy, Culture, and Language Education. He teaches courses and does research related to adolescent and adult literacy, as well as the use of technology in language and literacy learning. The research for which he is most widely known relates to workplace literacy and the use of technology in relation to language and literacy. In addition, he coordinates the nearly 24 online courses offered by the Language Education Department. And this is Mr. Terry Dougherty. Wonderful. He is finishing his 39th year of teaching for MCCSC. He has taught science and computer technology at the middle school level for 37 of those years. In addition to that, he was a methods teacher for instructional technology at IU. He's been involved in coaching sports and science teams. During his tenure, he's been a teacher association member, involving him with many committees for the school corporation. He's been a national school reform faculty member for the past 5 years, and he now has a new role in MCCSC as coordinator for instructional technology. Thank you. This is Mrs. Deborah Wessel. She has 3 education degrees from IU Bloomington and has had a very diverse career. Has worked in 3 school corporations in southern Indiana and England. Spent 37 years, you guys are very similar, in elementary education, grades K and 1. Special education, self-contained, resource and inclusion. She's been an assistant elementary principal, the director of the summer program in England, case conference coordinator, consulting teacher, First Steps developmental therapist, an ESL teacher, a teacher mentor, and she just finally retired, well-deserved I'm sure, in 2010 from public schools. And this is Kathy, and I'm sure she has a wonderful bio, which she will share with you now, because she's kind of a latecomer to our campus.
Not on the web, though, apparently.
Yeah, I couldn't just fine.
So I spent the first 20 years of my career in public education in Monroe County schools. I went to high school with Margaret, and whose husband is soon to be a very famous author and has great work on the internet. But I have spent the last 3 years working with the Bloomington Project School and the Indianapolis Project School as a founder for those two public charter schools, and 3 years as a visiting faculty member here at IU in literacy, culture, and language.
Oh, great. Well, thanks so much for being here. You said that much better than I could. Okay, so the way this evening's going to proceed is we're going to give all of our esteemed panelists a few moments to speak about whatever they'd like to from the movie, any kind of perspective they'd like to bring from their own personal experience or a theoretical standpoint. So we'll give each of you around 5-ish minutes. If it goes a little beyond 5, it's tough, I know, in 5 minutes. And then we'll proceed to allowing questions from all of you. Anyone that's interested just can stand up or sit down and speak up, and we'd love to hear those, and you may ask the panelists. And we're going to keep this kind of an open, friendly discussion and forum where we honor all sorts of ideas. It's certainly not meant to sort of be a debate format, but it is meant to kind of be an open dialogue about the ideas brought up in the film. And then after that, we'll proceed to some of these note cards, and if we have some more time, ask some of those questions. So without further ado, do you mind starting out with some thoughts?
Sure.
Okay.
Never have a loss for me.
I
Yeah, I'm not really sure where to start. I think the movie does a great job of really identifying the biggest problem that we have as a society in educating our very diverse population. I'm not as convinced, I think, as the movie producer, Guggenheim, is in that there's an answer, a Superman. A silver bullet that will, and that's charter schools or vouchers or privatizing public schools. I do know that what makes for that unions have caused a lot of difficulty in efforts to reform schools and public education, and I don't think there's any doubt about that, especially when you look at but there's lots of problems. Central administration, many of the things that came out in the movie. There are a few things, just and not to ruin the effect of the movie, but you should know that 4 out of 5 charter schools. This is according to Donna Goldstein from Columbia University. 4 out of 5 charter schools don't do any better than public schools in terms of what we call academic performance or test scores. And that's a whole other problem. I thought it was kind of interesting. I was just looking at an article by Charles Murray, who's a very conservative, I guess, scholar who works at the American Enterprise Institute, one of the most conservative think tanks in the country. And he wrote an article called "Why Charter Schools Fail the Test," and his conclusion is that because we're measuring what a good school is in a completely ridiculous way, and that is by a single score on a single test, and that is not even standardized other than in a statewide level, and that it's important to understand that progressive educators have been trying to sound the alarm about what Kozol called savage inequalities in our educational system, which I think this movie showed very nicely, the savage inequalities. But as I said, there's not, when you look at the broader picture, there isn't a silver bullet to these problems. There are some charter schools that are incredible. As Gates said, when you look at the best charter schools, 98% of their kids go on to very successful academic careers. And we have, changed as a society. I went to a public school that we also had 98% of our students go to college. And so it's I think misleading, I guess, is what I would call the movie. Not so much in its portrayal of the problems, including the problems with big city unions, but in suggesting that there's a relatively simple solution, and that would be to try to make all schools charter schools. A good school does have many characteristics that a charter school has, such as the ability of a leader who's deeply committed and loves children and knows a good teacher when he sees it. You know, I always think that good teaching is like pornography. You know, I can't really explain what it is, but I know it when I see it. and yet, for the last 30 years, conservatives have really been in the driver's seat when it comes to education, and we haven't seen any improvement from their efforts, I don't think. And yet, we think if we just come up with a list of what a good teacher is and try to, align a curriculum to that list, that will result in good teachers. Like any occupation, there's going to be bad teachers and good teachers and great teachers. And just like there are great lawyers and bad lawyers, or great doctors and bad doctors. Although the statistic about how many bad teachers get fired, I think, is problematic. I myself have witnessed inner city school teachers literally reading the newspaper in their class as they've have their students just do worksheets, and they turn them in, and when they get the worksheet done, they get another worksheet, or they're told to read and be quiet. And now we even think that things like scripted curriculum is the way to go. And I do know that the one generalized comment I can make about good teachers is that they're all different. They're all very unique. And their teaching is an expression of their creativity. And if you take that creativity away by trying to overly standardize and reproduce, schools are not like fast food restaurants. You just can't reproduce them as easily. Some of the things that weren't in this movie also, I think, is that, like the public school PS 83 in Harlem actually has done a better job than the Success Academies in terms of improving children's test scores. So not all public schools in inner cities are bad or are doing a poor job. And then there's also a hidden, I think, advantage to charter schools, and you saw it in the movie, but it wasn't presented as an advantage, and that was the fact that every child who is trying to get into a charter school have parents who really want to give their children a great education. And you can't, I don't think there's a way to offset that. I mean, charter schools have an advantage in that sense, that they get what some people in academia call the creaming of the student population. And public schools, in ways, although I'm not suggesting that I would be against charter schools in general, but as the parents that care the most about their kids' education find options, the other kids and the other parents, they get stuck in public schools. And I don't think that hidden advantage should be completely ignored, which I think this movie did. Another thing that was particularly advantage, and this is my last comment, about the Harlem experiment, and that didn't come out in the film, is that, as Diane Ravitch calls it, that's supported by what she calls the Billionaire Boys Club, Gates being one of them. Canada has been extremely successful at generating millions of dollars, and that those children not only get a good education, but they get food, they get medical care, they get all the kinds, because Canada knew that you had to have the right context or the community or the support systems for a good education. Kids who go to school hungry are not going to learn very well. Kids that often suffer from asthma from living in inner cities, if they don't get proper medical treatment, they're not going to do very well in school. And Canada was smart enough, I think, but he was also, you know, these billionaire boys clubs, they're not going to replace taxes. They're not going to be able to educate all kids. And that's really the challenge, I think, for our public school system, is that we have to educate and figure out some way. And I don't have the answer myself, but so I'm sorry if I'm down.
Thanks, Dr. Goodman.
I think it's all about excellence. And we know what it takes to be excellent. We know that if you've got a team of really effective teachers who've shown that they spend time, and usually it is experienced teachers like Canada suggested, although every once in a while somebody in their first year turns out to just be excellent. But usually it takes a few years. But if you have a team of teachers, maybe as many as half in the school, who can work together, and they're smart, and they're knowledgeable, so they know how to change what they're doing for the different needs of kids, and they're willing to work really much harder than the average bear. They're spending a lot of time, and maybe that's will, maybe it's their life is a situation. They don't have any sick kids themselves. They don't have any other sorts of things that are stealing their emotions and energy. But we know that if you put together people like that, and you can do it for a lot longer time than 6 hours a day for 179 days, minus snow days. And if you can have a situation where the kids and the parents have mostly bought into it, they're going to be trying to. If you have those kinds of situations, kids learn. Also high expectations. So there's quite a list of things that we know are needed for almost any kid. I won't say every, but almost any kid to learn. And sometimes some charter schools, about 1 in 5, are able to provide that. And sometimes public schools are able to provide that. That's excellence, beyond average. Julie mentioned that a lot of my research has been in the workplace, and for the last 3 decades I have yet to see an occupation that has more than 1/3 of its members who perform at a level that most of society thinks everybody in the occupation ought to be performing at. Now, not just teachers, doctors, lawyers, auto mechanics, the people who spray your house to get rid of bugs. And it matters. People who handle nursing homes. It matters. Everybody wants excellence. Excellence is hard to come by. And it doesn't just happen because you fire somebody who isn't excellent. And it doesn't just happen because you provide a greater reward. Those things can help. And I think that what I take from this movie is it is heartrending to see another parent watch hope drift away for their own child because they can't find a place where excellence lives. And it's heartrending when you realize that those parents don't have the resources that somebody 5 miles away across town might have to pay for extra tutoring or extra lessons or extra whatevers that go beyond what's being paid just for the education. Some people are able to find more excellence and create more islands of excellence for their own kids than others. And until we, I think, look at what does it take to create an island of excellence or an archipelago of excellence, I won't hope to get to a continent totally of excellence, because what that does is it flies in the face of my intelligence to suggest that everybody in Lake Wobegon is above average. So, to me, what this says is it's time to really look beyond the Superman of, gosh, bust the unions and it'll be okay. Gosh, fire the ineffective teachers and it'll be okay. Gosh, just let charters take over and it'll be okay. None of those things are true. You know, Finland has a stronger teacher union than almost any country in Europe.
And no charter schools.
And no charter schools. However, a lot more freedom and responsibility about how to handle their classes is negotiated by the unions in Finland, and there's a lot of other sorts of things that go with it. The simple, as Jesse suggested, the simple solutions of bust this or buy that aren't going to do it. But, and I assume that, you know, it's Friday night, my God, you're here. I'm assuming that you have a career in education that you want to invest yourself in. And what I'm suggesting is, one of the better ways to do that, building on this movie and your own experience and those of your colleagues around you, is to look for ways to put together those islands of excellence. You know, we can get into lots of discussions about pros and cons of this or pros and cons of that. But the bottom line is, if you're going to participate in education for children, for adults, for yourself, it's how do you put together that package of excellence, and what can you do to push more towards it? And I think that's the message I take from this. Thank you.
Thank you. Right on 5 minutes.
And my department meetings get out on time, too.
And mine don't.
Can I take a look at some of those papers?
I didn't want to see this movie. It's been a tough time teaching lately. I told the crowd Saturday at the public education rally that one of the things I've found over all these years doing all the things that I have done is that one of the things I do know is that teaching is a very honorable profession. Parents put so much hope into your classroom with their child. And you know that as a teacher. You know it. You know, nobody plans to be a bad teacher. But it happens. But the thing is, you know you've got to be a mentor to that child because they listen to everything you say. You know that you've got to help them grow. And that you're responsible for everything that happens to them. The other thing I know about teaching is I always feel like I'm one incident away from losing my job. I mean, one thing can happen and your job is gone. Now, you may not have been, it may not have been true. I've gone through my situations where, things happen and next thing I know, my job could be gone. But besides that, no matter what, I know that this is a very honorable profession. I think also, though, I felt like the movie maybe played a little fast and loose with facts. I always like it when you show a chart, where'd that come from? Who did it? What are the numbers? I like to see those sort of things, so I know. I know recently Bill Gates said classroom size. Teachers don't care if they have large classes. I went back and looked at the study. They asked teachers, which would you rather do? Get $5,000 and keep 2 more students, or lose 2 students? Well, I got news for you, folks. If you offer somebody $5,000 in teaching for just 2 kids, they'll take it. That doesn't mean I want a larger class size. I know that when I get over 24 kids, each child makes me a little less effective. For 24 kids, I can get around to everybody 3 or 4 times in a class period and talk to them and know what they're about. But when I have 31, 32, now I'm starting to deal with pockets of kids that I need to just deal with to make the classroom work and not be dangerous. And so, I want to know facts. Yeah, unions can be problems, and I only know the union I'm in, in the community I'm in. In the community I'm in, the association, we don't call it a union, we call it a teachers association. It's us, It's the people in the school with you. There's nobody back in the back room smoking a big cigar, pulling ropes, making things happen, We get together, we have discussion with the principals about things that matter, you know. Things happen in the hallways, we want to sit down and talk about it because we're the eyes and ears. And we know what's going on. I think that's why a lot of people out there are fighting in Wisconsin and in Indianapolis and places like that to try to protect some of those. Those discussions are more important to us than maybe the money discussions most of the time. Because heck, we know. I'm right now bargaining. I'm probably bargaining our salaries down and our time up. And our insurance less. None of that feels good. But for sure what I want to do is protect people, have the chance to have a voice in the school. And that's important. Speaking of voice, they mentioned the National School Reform faculty, you know, CFGs, critical friends groups, and some of you have heard about these, and some of you have been in them. Some of you trained me. You know, I was in a school that had 80% of the teachers in groups that did, you know, had those hard discussions that pushed back on ideas and things that we were doing. Those discussions were very important because we were also up against the wall of trying to, I don't want to say dumb down our school. What can I call it? But we've got this pressure of teaching to a test, and it's even worse. It keeps getting worse. And we want to have creative classes. The most creative class at the school I was at was the class that taught video, well, with BTV. They taught video editing, and they put out a show, and they did movies. That was the most creative class. There was nothing there that was strictly about that class that was on the standardized test. But it was all about that test, really, in a sense, you know. And that was the most creative class we had. You know, the music, the arts, all that. And we're shrinking those down every day. So I watch, and I wish public schools could be more like charter schools. But instead, you know, the charter schools are held up to be in this movie at least, the great schools to be. And public schools, we keep squeezing them down and squeezing them down. And I guess the good thing I take away from this movie also is at least when those kids who didn't make the charter school, when they didn't make it, they at least had a public school to go back to. You know, maybe, I hope it becomes a great public school if they go back to. Because that's the one thing that I think all kids should be able to count on. And that's what we didn't see, is they have a school to go to, an institution that's there. That's the one thing that we owe them, you know. I don't know what happens if we're all charter schools or all private schools, but I know that we should have schools. It's not however we think them, I don't know.
I did all those things that was on that sheet, but in my heart, I am just a kindergarten teacher. And that's what I come to know today. I also wanted to say that I have for many, many, many years been a host to the School of Ed's really experienced teachers and student teachers, and I have had probably hundreds and have enjoyed that very, very much. So thank you, School of Ed, for sending those great people my way. I'm not a political person, and I'm not really into statistics. So I'm going to talk more about what the gut feeling was here. There was a little bit in the movie about you know, them and us, you know, and I was going to say this too. Good. And we have wonderful, my experience, in fact, those schools that were in the movie are really outside of my experience. Those really disheartening settings that we saw in the movie, they're outside of my experience. In Bloomington, we have great Christian schools, and people homeschool, and we have Montessori, and we have public school, and we have public schools, and harmony, yes, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, just really feels the atmosphere here feels good. So what I felt for those children was really sad, but also what as a public school teacher, I felt like I had was suddenly the enemy, the way I was portrayed, and that felt terrible. So that's what I'm bringing to the discussion. Because teachers work so hard, you know, and then, gosh, have I seen some master teachers? It's just amazing. And speaking of, one of you spoke to the bar that we're measured by and how that's probably not the best way to look at a school. Having done a lot of special ed, I'm always sad that, or in ESL as well, that we seem to ask the most of our kids who have the most challenges. They're the ones that we're asking to make the biggest jumps. It's just doesn't make much common sense. That's my point of view.
So what I've really been thinking about since Jessie started speaking was that if my criticism of the movie feels a little bit like telling an author to change their ending. That it, you know, wasn't my script and it wasn't my agenda, and I'm sure whatever they wanted to portray is what they portrayed. My worry in a much broader picture is that I think that there's really a tremendously concerted effort to pit educators against each other, so that the conversation becomes about charter schools and traditional public schools and private schools, rather than about what we need to be doing for kids and families and for teaching and learning. And so that just breaks my heart that in every newspaper, in every news magazine, probably in the Inquirer, I don't read it, so I don't know, but what do you know, Nick? Is it there? I mean, I really
all the time. All the time.
I feel like that's the in many ways the priority, and I think in many ways we've bitten the hook, because rather than having conversations about how we're effectively meeting kids' needs in different places and what that brings to us, how that's transferable, if there are possibilities of how we can do that elsewhere, that by, you know, concentrating on it's us against them, it definitely gets us off the important topics. And that's a real struggle for me. The other struggle for me is that in no way in this movie, and again, I'm, you know, criticizing somebody else's work, and that feels odd to me, but in no way did they clearly articulate that charter schools are public schools. We are public schools. We aren't private schools where we interview your kid and decide if they get in or not. We aren't private schools that determine that there's a certain standard you must meet. We take ISTEP or whatever or in Virginia it's called the SOL, which I kind of think they're the only standard that tells you but, whatever, they say it stands for Standards of Learning, but so, you know, we don't do those things. We do 180 days. We have at least the minimum school day. In fact, one of the choices we've made is to have a school day that goes from 8 to 3:30, which is a significantly longer school day, with some professional development time on Wednesday. That means we have about a little over 3 hours extra of instruction each week. And that's substantial when you look at it, you know, it adds up, the time adds up. So, you know, so that's a frustration for me. I think that if I could make one change in the movie, it would be around the clarity of those two issues. And for me, I find irony in the idea that there were a total of 2 charter schools really highlighted, and they were both outstanding. And there were a handful of traditional public schools that were highlighted, and they really sucked. Like nobody in this room would send their kid to those schools at this point, given any option. And I find that appalling because, you know, this is our life's work. The life work that we have done is about work in public schools for all kids. So that's really, I think, a tricky piece. The other piece I want to say, and it's a little bit, Jessie, respectfully a reaction to something you said, because I think the dynamics that we saw in the movie were very much about families that were incredibly present and focused on educational opportunities for their kids. They were families who recognized that by making a choice and making a different choice than was available to them, there could be a difference. But charter schools that are worth their salt and charter schools that are truly committed to being a public school that serves all kids are out there. We did 30 meetings last year with Head Start families. We did meetings with Monroe County United Ministries. We did meetings, we stood at the door as people came to pick up their kid. No matter what level of engagement you have in your child's preschool, you still have to pick them up. And so we stood there and we rallied to give information so that parents would know they had a choice. We presented Second Baptist Church, a community often underserved in public schools in general. We go to the Latino Mass at St. Paul's with Spanish interpreters from our school to talk about the kinds of options that might be available. So I agree that in the movie it was portrayed in a way that we receive, and I mean that literally as a passive statement, we receive those students whose families are actively engaging in making the choice. But the truth is, for the founders of the charter school in this town, we started a charter school because we found ourselves in situations that no longer supported our beliefs. It wasn't that it didn't work for thousands of kids, and there weren't fantastic options for thousands of kids. But as educators, we felt very strongly that living our beliefs was critical, and our number one belief is about ending the predictive value of race and class and gender and special capacities in school and in life. And to do that, we couldn't open a private school because then we're back to serving only those families with resources. So I think that generalizing in any way charter schools is exactly the same damage that's done when we every day people generalize traditional public school districts and say, well, this is what I know about public schools, or this is what I know about public charter schools. No, you don't. You know it maybe about the ones you know or the specific research you've done, but to extrapolate that out, even to the 300 school districts in Indiana, does exactly what we circle back around to, is that the goal then only is to pit educators against each other instead of bringing them together about what we can do.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for sharing your thoughts. And at this time, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions or comments. We ask that you keep your questions sort of as questions and that you keep them concise so that we can hear as many voices as we can. Great. Let's start with you.
Kind of response to the last question, or the last comment you made. So imagine that I've become the governor of Indiana.
Oh,
well,
great.
I'll vote for you.
No, so what would you do then if you can't study one school and generalize anything to any other school? Would you have to assess each school independently? I'm just kind of curious what your reaction is.
Yes. I mean, first of all, I do think you have to assess each school independently, just as you do have to assess each teacher independently. I mean, it would be, really ridiculous for me to assume, because I've seen Debbie's classroom, which was phenomenal, that I could make that assumption about all other kindergarten classrooms in the school she was in. I mean, we would want to fire principals who looked at it that way. So I'm not sure how, as a governor, it's any more acceptable. The other thing for me about, ooh, that sounds really political. I think I'm just going to keep that one. Can you share, please? I'll tell you later.
The question you're asking really is, how do you tell that there's quality? Back to my original remarks about excellence. And that's one that as a profession we've really dodged for years and years and years. Most of us have taken money for grading somebody. But we're really, really uncomfortable to have somebody grade us. And with good reason. Any sort of assessment system has problems. There's one standardized test, it's got all kinds of problems. If it's a portfolio assessment that takes time away from teaching to put together, it has problems. But until we do grapple with that, how do you tell whether this teacher, this classroom, this school, this city is doing as well as others in the same situation or in similar situations, then I think you really do sidestep that question of accountability. And we've not been, as a profession, particularly good at doing that. Not that a lot of other professions, I have a wife who's a clinical psychologist, and they've not really done a very good job in their area of policing excellence, and have had to live with it being put on them externally. And I think that's a situation that we're in. And your comment about, okay, don't just say nothing generalizes and then sit smugly there, because, okay, that's fine, but still, as Jesse says, you can spot it when you see it.
Yeah. Well, and Larry, I think part of the consequences that we've paid for are exactly because of what you said. Because we weren't out in front of it saying, you know, here's how we identify quality. This is how it relates to students achieving. And these are some of the ways we're going to hold ourselves accountable. So
Yeah,
somebody else did it for us.
Just as an aside, about 10 years ago, teachers in the reading minor program at the undergraduate level in this school of education and in 6 others around the country had how well they taught compared. They followed the undergraduates as they went into teaching for their first year and compared how well their students did on standardized tests compared to the first-year teacher across the hall, and also somebody with 3 years teaching experience. And they also had a qualitative aspect to the study where you looked at what were they doing in the classroom and does it match things that people say are good things to do with teaching literacy. And what it turned out was people in the School of Education's program and those of other schools that had the extra education, they did twice as well as first-year teachers across the hall and 50% better than third-year teachers. So it is, but that study took a lot of time and energy and money to put together. There are, more time than almost anybody here in this school has been willing to do without some external funding for help. So we do know some ways that are complicated and expensive to track excellence. We flinch at spending the money to do that when it steals time away from kids learning, and as we ought to. But until we do deal with how do we show where excellence and mediocrity and poorness exist within our own profession, we have to live with somebody else putting it on us, I believe.
Great. We'll come to the audience in just one moment. There's a question from our index cards. It's kind of related to these achievement measures. So the question reads, we heard that student achievement was flat from 1971 to 2008. I'm not sure where that comes from. Are standardized tests from 1971 comparable to 2008? Has anyone tried administering old tests to today's students? So basically just questioning sort of how standardized tests have evolved.
I used to run the Center for Innovation Assessment here on campus. And yes, they take some items that were on older tests and put them on the new tests so they can kind of build a bridge. And with a little bit of going up and down, it is true that the reading and math scores they're a little better, they aren't worse, but they aren't infinitely better. The gap between ethnicities has closed a bit.
Does that take into account the larger pool that I think that we're testing now?
No, it doesn't.
No. So we're testing more kids
it's
from
really
more
important,
beginning
like
levels.
when they said about the 1950s or 60s, there were a whole bunch of children of color who just weren't going to school, and especially in rural areas throughout the United States. And it's important to understand that, like, again, in Finland, less than 3% of their children live in poverty, whereas over 20% of our children live in poverty. And it just seems ridiculous to try to make these kinds of comparisons. And so, yeah, I think Larry's right. I don't know how you get to a place where when you see it, you know it, and how you would generalize that. I do know that when I think about teachers that I've, admired in their work, it is hard to generalize. They often have very unique qualities to intellectually engage the kids. And I don't know how to, to reproduce that like, Kentucky Fried Chicken's been able to reproduce fried chicken. I wish I did, but I just don't know. how to do
Some
it.
of theirs are better than others also.
Great, we have another question, yeah.
One of the things that really caught my attention for some reason in the movie was the idea of tracking and the idea that that goes away in charter schools entirely. And also like the absence of special education taken into account. So like, I guess the way that they portrayed it, and I know we're talking about like very specific schools, is that all the students are taking the same thing. And as you said, for us to look at our special education students and our ESL students and expect them to make these giant leaps, how can we expect them to take all the same classes as all the other students? Like, I don't think that that's a reasonable expectation, or even an expectation that is truly going to benefit the student, like, at large. So I don't know, it's just...
And remember, in the 60s, early 60s, there wasn't any special education.
I know, and that's another thing, is we're not looking at the fact that those students were institutionalized, you know, back in the 50s. They weren't trying to be put into general education classrooms as they are today.
Also, in that era, there was intact families, and that's sort of a rare thing. You don't have it.
For me, those were both huge generalizations as well.
Yeah,
You know,
I mean, I figured they were.
Yeah, I think you caught one, the two that are really important, you know, that are, again, they were sort of presented as, this is what happens in charter schools.
And as educators, you all know that differentiation is very important. That's what we owe our students, to take each one where they are and take them as far as they can go.
In a Stanford study, and again, just to break up these generalizations, that I think the problem with the movie was its implied solution to the very difficult problems that as a society we face in trying to educate our children. And I'm not going to say so they can all be Nobel laureates, but in a meaningful way. And but if you just used, you know, these kind of absurd general test scores as a way of doing it, Stanford came up and said 17% of charter schools in general outperform public schools, but 37% underperform public schools, if you look at it generally. This movie, as I can't remember who said it, looked at the best charter schools and compared them to the worst public schools. And it's just not that. I just wish there was a magic bullet. I wish there was a Superman. It would make things so much easier if there was.
Okay, another question. This individual wrote, I know the documentary was relatively one-sided, but what kind of accountability does the university have for failing teachers?
A word of blame.
So do they have
If anybody's here, by failing teachers, can you tell them that means failing?
the question.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. Sure. What kind of accountability does a university have for failing teachers?
You're talking about university teachers?
No, I believe teachers in the public, you know, K through 12.
And they got their degree, they went out in the job, they failed.
Right.
So what's the fallback on the university?
Do anything about it?
I know when I student taught, and I student taught when we had a lot of, I was a part of 175 science teachers in science ed. I don't know if we ever graduated that many again. But I remember all of us going out student teaching, and they had this bright idea to bring us all back together about 4 weeks into student teaching into a big auditorium to talk to us. It was a riot. We were going, what the hell, what were you thinking? Put this out there without letting us know that kids are mean, you know? I don't think they ever did that again. But, you know, one thing I find interesting, before I go away from that, something that I thought of recently, I was talking to a teacher, because of the way the evaluation system for teachers is going in public schools, where you have to have a 1.5 year growth to have an excellent certification. A kid, by the time a student is in 9th grade, they should actually be juniors in college by the growth standards we're talking about. This teacher said, I can no longer have a student teacher in my classroom because I am responsible for all the growth of all my kids. That doesn't answer your question, but...
It's like anything else, you know, one of the one of the elements of a good education is, one of the misleading ideas in the movie is that somehow, while teachers are extremely important in the quality of the education, kinds of students you have also is an element, as is the family, as is the community, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just one thing. I've been fortunate enough to start and direct a teacher education program here at Indiana University for elementary pre-service teachers. And when people say, many of the local teachers and principals have really like having our students in there, and they say, well, what's different about your program than others? And I said, well, it's, first of all, it's a master's level program, so we get older students, and they're often more, and there's a lot of cognitive science research that shows that there's actually more growth between the age of 22 and 26 than there is between 18 and 22. There's all kinds of factors involved in what makes a good either teacher education program or a K-12 education program or a PhD program. People who argue that teacher education makes no difference. In fact, many people today are saying it would be better without teacher preparation programs. My response to that goes back to a guy named Seymour Silverson. When I was a graduate student who wrote an interesting book about teacher education, and one of the comments he made was, if you really believe that, all you have to do is go to college, because there are plenty of teachers in college who've never spent a day thinking about pedagogy. They know a whole lot about whatever subject they're teaching, but they have no idea how to communicate with kids or intellectually engage students in their subject area that they're experts in. So, and that really makes sense to me. Anybody who's gone to college knows that there are plenty of very smart people who don't know anything about teaching.
Great, yes, sir.
One of the comments that you made brought me thinking about something. So what profession besides perhaps being a college professor are you not one incident away from something being possibly fired? And then also, you are who you associate with, and if you're associated, I'm thinking of New York City teachers, you're associated with those teachers that are falling asleep or in that kind of detention that look like, why would you want to associate yourself with those other people that, so I wouldn't want, if I'm one of the best teachers, I wouldn't want to associate with one of the worst teachers. Has there been any movement between the unions to have, the excellent teacher union? So they separate themselves from the people that the teachers that are not doing well.
Let me respond to a couple of things. One is that, teachers don't get fired. They resign or retire.
They are forced to resign.
Well, I mean, they don't want to go through that humiliation. I mean, very few teachers go through that. So the numbers you see look low. Whereas we had a doctor recently that fought tooth and nail to keep his job, even though you look at the evidence, you go, oh my gosh, I was surprised how long he held on. But the other thing that happens, maybe it's just me. I don't know. Maybe it's my building. Maybe it's other buildings. But I think teachers do feel a responsibility to either help the teacher or to help them move on. I've worked with several teachers who, when it works right, and you know about this, when it works right, the teacher gets an improvement plan because there's problems. You work through that improvement plan. You help them with that improvement plan. Here are the steps you need. We're going to give you some help. And you go through that. And if they don't make it, then you start working on the procedures to fire them. Now, I was interested in the 23 steps. I don't know.
That was substantial.
Yeah.
And also, the definition of tenure doesn't match what my definition here is in Monroe County. Because
most places.
Can you tell us what it is?
Here it's
due process.
Due process. It's the right to due process. You can't just be fired without
Cause.
Right. Without cause. But you certainly aren't guaranteed a job.
What is the due process? Because from my experience, I was at a school that I felt like a lot of teachers probably should have been fired. But the way that they were explaining it was there's so many observations have to happen by this time. And I even had a teacher who said, if he doesn't come in at this time and I get in trouble, I'm going to argue it. like she could have appealed it because the principal couldn't come in at the right time. So if she would have been up for firing, she wouldn't have gotten fired because the principal couldn't make it in that one half an hour. So the way I understand
one of
it
the things
is
about due process, you can't get fired because a parent calls and says you're a bad teacher.
Right.
You can't go through hearsay. You've got to observe it. You've got to have some facts. You have to have something there. I mean, if you're going to lose your job and your career, there ought to be some proof.
Right.
You know. And so that's the process. Now, you know, a principal had 2 observations by November 15th.
Right, depending on the year of teaching you were in.
Two observations by November 15th. If you're a bad teacher, come on, you ought to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And yet, I saw teachers. We got a teacher that came to our building, and we were told by the superintendent, fire this person. Lousy teacher, fire them. This came from the high school.
The passing of trash.
Yes, the passing of trash. Right, and there's a reason for that too. It's not just the union. It's also
absolutely.
A principal hires a teacher. They don't want to admit they did a bad job. Just kind of move them on, and they usually end up in middle school. But we went back to review this teacher's. You know, I sat down with the principal. Said, we got problems here. We got to do something. So we look. Teacher has never been observed. Never.
So maybe the problem is the principals.
Well, sometimes, but as far as maybe that piece, but they're also overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed with minutia and junk that they don't need to be doing. You know, but the other thing is though that when we look into her background, she never student taught. She came through adult ed as a second language teacher. Came through the back door of education from another state with a reciprocal license. She didn't know much about working with kids, and yet we hired her. You know, we had her pass that 3-year term. So now we have to go through due process of approval.
Any follow-up questions?
A couple of years, I think it was just 2 years ago, the Center for Evaluation and Educational Policy, Keith, here at IU, did a study of charter schools, and CEL, the Center for Educational Leadership and Learning, in Indianapolis did a study of charter schools. In Indiana, just looking at Indiana. And it was really interesting. They came up with 2 very different outcomes. Keith said that basically charter schools do no better, and maybe even a little worse than traditional schools. And CEL said that there's very little difference. It's not a significant difference, but that the kids going to charter schools came in from much lower socioeconomic backgrounds with parents with much less education. Now I'm wondering if that's a national trend. I understand that may be true in Indiana. My experience with charter schools suggests that most charter schools are there to serve kids who's been historically marginalized and disenfranchised, families who have been historically unsuccessful in schools, and are working with that population and achieving at almost the same level as the statewide or national average. So I'm wondering how much that has been part of the assessment of the success of charter schools, and whether there's a misunderstanding that charter schools serve kids whose parents are really so invested in, they come eager to learn and don't come with the damage that they've experienced in life in other schools for 6 or 8 or 10 years before they come to a charter school.
You know what it would take to get the answer to your question, right?
Research.
Money, time, somebody to take a look at more than just the data on the schools off the internet, somebody to visit a sampling of those schools, to look, or some way of comparing charter schools with comparable populations. And I don't know that anybody has had the time or the resources, and because it's such a hot political football, maybe even the inclination to look at that. At a gut level, I'm guessing that there's probably not too much difference between the performances. Maybe a little bit better because you've got a selection of teachers who've chosen to be where they want to be. And that's one factor that may be different between the two. But the really complex questions, like Jesse's asked, or you've asked, or many of you have in your mind, take a lot of resources and time and energy to answer. And it's all in the midst of this becoming a political football. To my mind, I mean, this question of how do you get excellence and charters or public, they're all really important questions, but they're occurring at a time when there's a real solid effort for people, taxpayers who have more than the average income, trying to find ways so they don't have to pay as much for other people's children's education. And that is going on, and that is the overarching umbrella for a lot of these other discussions. And we as educators need to also recognize that that's an element that's going on here. And we can read critically, we can listen critically, but bottom line, I think it's every single week, every single year, what's the new context we're working in? What can you do to create, I mentioned Island of Excellence. What can you do to do that? Whether it's starting your own school, or whether it's trying to figure out a way with your colleagues in the one you are, or maybe sometimes it's to bail out because the place you are just isn't going to make it, and you can tell that, and there's a better place to invest your life.
Malcolm Gladwell did, reported the results of an interesting study also that looked at suburban public schools and inner city public schools in Baltimore. And they tested the kids at the beginning of the year, and then they tested the kids at the end of the school year. And even though the kids in the inner cities were on average 2 to 3 grade levels behind in both reading and math than the suburban kids, the growth of both kids was about the same. However, when they tested the kids the following fall, after summer school, after summer was over, the kids from the suburban schools hadn't lost any ground in reading and math, whereas the kids in the urban areas had lost a tremendous amount of, they had almost gone back almost to where they began at the beginning of the year. And so the conclusion of that study was if we just went to year-round schools, or if we had more, as I think Larry has tried to suggest, more thoughtful ways of assessing. The Stanford study did take into account socioeconomic backgrounds, although not racial backgrounds and things like that. They've taken socioeconomic background in their study. But there's lots of other studies that have been done that, I think your point is really well taken. That, like for example, I was reading an article where the project school in Indianapolis was well below the average of all of Indiana. But the project school in Indianapolis, even though compared to other IPS schools, actually had a more diverse student population, had both ethnically as well as socioeconomically. But to compare that school to all of the other schools in Indiana just seemed ridiculous, I think, because it was like comparing apples to oranges. And that's a lot of what happens with education. We rarely, actually look at the growth that someone does in a school year. We, pick them in 4th grade and 8th grade and try to make comments about that. And so I think Larry is actually right in the sense that, we are often looking for easy ways and cheap ways to be able to, quote, measure good schools or student growth, and it's not, and that's not been producing any real results, I think, as I said.
But this whole measurement piece,
exactly.
No Child Left Behind, it was very, the most positive thing I saw was the fact that we are flatlined. We didn't measure schools in the 70s, right, and hardly at all in the 80s. A little bit in the 90s, and then 2000, when we really started going crazy with it. We're the same. When we didn't measure, we're the same. Maybe a little bit better.
And what's a realistic, realistically, you can't expect people to, improve their academic performance.
But the difference, I'll tell you the difference. I call it the standards-based student anymore. They've had now, 8, 9 years of standards education, where the standards are on the wall, we're doing this because of the standards, we're doing this because of the standards, the standards, that. And they come in and they just, they're zoned out. They get it. It's about the standards. I talked, and this is a story that you and I know because I told it to you. I was at a Christmas party with a family, and I remember my family just started teaching. She's been teaching, I think it's her second year, like a year and a half into teaching because it's Christmas time. And we were talking about teaching stuff. She said something about the standards, and I went, she goes, "You don't like standards?" I go, "No, I don't like the standards very well, no." You know, I've always known what I was supposed to be teaching. They had something called proficiency, stuff like that, but I wasn't always measured by them in every move and everything I did. I was allowed to have some freedom with what I did, a little bit. But she said, "I love the standards because every day I know exactly what I'm teaching with my class. I know exactly what I'm going to do because I have the standards to guide me in everything I'm going to do." I can't even imagine what teachers used to do before. What did they do before they had the standards? How did they plan their day?
They were intellectually engaged.
They said, I said, teachers used to sit down and think, how can I make my kids love learning today?
Yeah.
Well, and she said to me, "I don't think about that."
Oh.
You know, because she's so focused on the standards she has to teach.
In fact, there's an interesting nomenclature that's gone on in a lot of schools, and in public schools, where teachers will say, "I have to hit the standard."
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of like, you know...
Or this is a good one, it hits all 4 standards.
Yeah, right.
Do you mind if I ask a question? This kind of goes along this, okay, if you're a parent, and let's just forget that I'm an educator too, and you go into, you say, okay, well, we can't afford the private schools, and we can't get into project school, so we're going to go to the public school, because that's our only option right now, aside from homeschooling, which, you know, that's great, but a PhD student, not so great. So, so you get into the public school, right, and you realize that you don't agree with that they're doing reading in the morning and they're doing math in the afternoon. And that when you say, well, where's the science? Oh, we don't do that because it doesn't hit the standards for 1st or 2nd grade. Well, where's the social studies? Well, that doesn't hit the standards. How do you not become very upset
the music
as a
teachers
parent?
and the art teachers are teaching reading during the day because they've got to hit the reading and the math.
Right, so how, I mean, I guess my question is, off of this movie, because this is what the movie's done for me, is how do you begin a reform without stepping on somebody's shoes or upsetting a principal or upsetting a teacher, a young teacher, and say, well, you know, we really do need to think outside the box. Let's not be afraid to go beyond the let's go beyond the standards. I mean, why can't they get away from that? Why?
I think it goes back to what Mary said.
You know, like, how do you deal with that as a parent?
To find a simple solution to a very complex problem. And teachers who are focused on the standards often, as unfortunately I think was so nicely articulated, are not being asked to really think about what they're teaching. You know, they're just rushing. I call it the skipping stone curriculum. And the irony is that teachers who are intellectually engaged in the subject matter and really do ask themselves every day, I remember reading a book a long time ago where one of the chapters was called crap detection. And it said, and the author of the book was trying to say that one of the best characteristics, you can always tell a good teacher because they can tell when they're teaching crap versus something meaningful and engaging and thought-provoking. And those teachers tend not to worry about standards. They tend to be intellectually engaged.
So would the union protect the teacher, though, if they didn't teach to the standards?
Yes, the union protects the process. I mean, that's the good and the bad, right? Is that what they protect is the process. And sometimes, unintentionally, that protects bad teachers if due process hasn't been followed. They don't protect Terry's philosophy or mine. That's not their job. Their job is to protect due process and to make sure that everyone is treated fairly and has the process followed fairly. I think, for me, first of all, I know you said you don't want to make principals mad. Like, there's a part of every day that we're mad. It's just in the handbook. I mean, it just is. But I think that the opportunity to really engage in actual conversation about what you think is important for your kid helps me in thinking about placement, for example. If I have 5 first grades and I hear from you about what you think is really important for your child, that helps. If you say, you know what, I'm a doc student and I work a lot in the area of critical literacy, and if you want a couple of hours of time, I'd be happy to sit with teachers who have any interest about how to integrate it in a way that it's done during reading and math. Because if you're doing your reader's workshop well, it's all about science and social studies integration as well. You know what I mean? So I think there are ways that you could supportively bring that conversation to the table without it feel like a demanding.
Yeah.
But schools are also involved right now into making teaching an applied science. If you do this, turn the screw right on this student, 1/4 turn, on every student that comes through, they will raise their reading score by 2 points.
It's like in the movie, we raise up their head.
Yeah. I mean, there is this procedure going on in our schools that is saying, and it's interesting because at the same time that the internet was going to change what we should be doing, which is helping kids find things and get through all this information, No Child Left Behind came around and said, no, let's memorize content. And yeah, and we have kids. I think schools in general that are trying to be measured constantly are going to be hitting this wall, and we're all trying to find an answer, and everybody's doing these prescriptive answers that aren't very good.
I think there are some answers, and some of them actually got suggested in this piece. Right now, there really isn't a career path for teachers. Novice teacher, experienced teacher, master teacher. And there are political reasons for that, that if teachers all are the same, you can bargain and you have more power. But every solution brings its own new problems, and I think that's brought a problem. So there isn't a career path for teachers. We are looking for a single solution to do two things. Identify poor teachers and get rid of them, while at the same time encouraging excellent teaching. Well, you can't really do that, because some of the means that you use to get rid of poor teachers are you enforce standards on them that maybe hobble the most creative teachers.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So my daughter has had 50 teachers in Monroe County. She's now in high school. And easily 20 of them have been really pretty good. The 1 or 2 that she's had that have been poor, the principal worked really, really hard. I tried to complain about these because of the dual role I have, but my wife feels perfectly free to. But the teacher who was mostly reading and giving kids hot chocolate in class and being a wonderful, warm person, but not teaching very much, the principal intervened and had her hooked up with another teacher, and then we found out later that she was teaching the teachers across the hall's lesson plans a week later, because those kids are in our neighborhood too, so everybody knows what's going on. And never really got her to the point of excellence, but she was doing more with reading and mathematics and some other things in class, which we were disappointed. We found it as a marginal improvement. The real solution is to find ways that there's a career path, that somebody who's working hard and is working smart can be recognized and move ahead.
So we probably just have time for 1, maybe 2 more questions. So maybe we'll start with you and then.
To go on your career path, and the big problem, how do we evaluate teachers? If we had teachers evaluating teachers, the best schools that I've seen, that I've read for, that didn't fire all their teachers, that built everybody up, are the ones who have time and they sub teachers out and they have those teachers go into classrooms of the best teachers, learn watching, and I guess from what I've studied, from what they've said in the studies, is that's how they learn the best, because then they can go back to the teacher at off times and ask them, just how did you implement it, how did you get this started, how are you at this point now, after watching it, and then they take what they can do out of that. And when you get enough good teachers, of course, you can do that with every teacher, or maybe even teachers who aren't the super highest, they do one thing extremely well. Well, when you have that, and that's how you build up teachers, and you get all teachers better that way, you can also start having teachers evaluate other teachers. Teachers decide who gets merit pay. Everybody starts at like a certain amount of pay. You only get an increased pay depending on where you land on the merit pay scale. And so you don't have to fire teachers anymore, because teachers who don't advance, who don't get better, they're always going to be like right near the bottom of the pay. They're always going to be on the IRF list, even though I wish we never had an IRF list. And then the teachers who are the very highest will, they're the ones who other teachers are saying are the best. They're the ones who are not only master teachers of students, but master teachers of teachers. Those are the ones for career, they should be the ones that end up being the next principals, because in this study, what I've read about principals are the best principals, the ones that advance their classes the most, their schools the most, are the ones who spend more than 50% of their time in the classroom, sometimes keeping their hand-ins on subbing, but being there in building up these teachers. So if the best teachers is voted by teachers by their merit pay are also the principals now you start to get more people in the administration who know exactly what they're talking about, who can actually help teachers rather than tear down, say, you know, we need to fire teachers. Well, in this system, you wouldn't need to fire teachers. They would get themselves.
I was talking about the school I was at where we had about 80% of the people in the CFGs. We did do observations of each other.
Yeah.
And we used protocols that were let's say non-evaluative, because you use those systems. But when it comes to merit pay, I don't know. Because I guess in my building, I've always seen everybody as valuable as possible in all those situations. And in CFGs, you value the difference of everybody. Yeah, there's some teachers that need help and maybe need to be moved along and moved out of the profession. There's also teachers who really grow.
I don't think many charter schools have merit pay.
Does
the local one?
No. We actually, our commitment to teachers is that they would make what they would make in the local school district. So they make what they would make in MCCSC. In our Indy school, they make what they would make in IPS. So
also, the state of Indiana has a mentor teacher program. So if you're a first or second year teacher, you will have a mentor teacher. Terry's a mentor, and I've been a mentor for our young teachers, so that's what we do.
We kind of have merit pay already in Indiana. The high school and basketball, football coaches, they get the merit.
So due to time, we're going to have another showing, but in respect for our panel folks, in respect to our time and your time, it is Friday night. I just wanted to say a last couple things. First, my name is Bryce Smedley. I'm also a PhD student in literacy, culture, language education, and I'm support staff at IU. Many of us are students, graduate students, community members, faculty, etc. I guess the important thing that the committee who organized this event wanted to stress to especially our students and everyone is that this is our learning lab, this is our school, and these issues affect us today, tomorrow, and in the future. And so take what we learn in the lessons and be engaged. It must extend outside of the classroom. Stay engaged, be engaged, and be the very best educational activist that you can possibly be. Because really, for many of us who are going out in the field, we need to be a part of these conversations, and we need to be engaged in our communities. And we want to thank everyone for coming and our panelists.